Hello, everyone, and welcome back once again here to our discussion of informal fallacies. Now, what we're going to do is turn our attention to the red herring fallacy. And remember that we've been dealing with fallacies that contain irrelevant premises. And the red herring is a particularly clear and obvious version of appealing to irrelevant premises. So now what this fallacy does, it occurs when someone raises a point that is not related at all to the issue or the main contention of the argument. All right, so that's why it's a very clear version of appealing to irrelevant premises. It's essentially just a form of distraction, trying to get you look in a different direction. It's called the red herring because this actually comes from the practice of dragging a smelly fish, which I believe was a herring, across the trail, an attempt to throw a hunting dog, off the scent while they're actually training the dog. So essentially, these hunters would want to make sure that the dog was going to stay fixed on what they're supposed to be doing and trying to, in the process of hunting. And so, in order to train the dog to make sure that they stayed focused, they would, take this smelly fish and put it across the trail to see whether or not the dog would get off its track. So we have named, philosophers and logicians named this fallacy the red herring because that's essentially what we're doing. Instead of staying focused on the argument, the main contention that's being argued for, instead we get distracted by the smelly fish that's being, taken and thrown across our trail in order to get us to, be distracted in some sense. A classic example of this is what you might have heard when people say, but her emails, right? This was something that you heard quite a bit during the 2016 presidential election, referring to Hillary Clinton. Right, because Hillary Clinton was going through an email scandal, and so you would hear people all the time whenever somebody would make an objection to something that Trump was doing or something that was going on in the Republican Party, people would in response say, but what about her emails? And of course, that's not relevant at all. And it's just a distraction. It's just getting people to pay attention to something else rather than the main contention of what's being argued for. And so again, it's like maybe the most obvious version of appealing to relevant premises. Insofar as we're interjecting something into the argument or the discussion that is not relevant at all, and in fact, it's designed to make you distracted, to pay attention to something else. So let's go ahead and take a look at a few examples to help us understand the fallacy. Imagine that you say to a friend, well, I think we need to address climate change and reduce carbon emissions. And then your friend says in response, oh, but what about all the jobs we've created in the coal industry? Okay, sure, maybe we've created some jobs in the coal industry, but that's irrelevant to whether or not we need to address climate change. It's irrelevant to whether or not we need to reduce carbon emissions. Or perhaps you could imagine some politician that says, what we need to do is we need to improve education. We need to do a better job of funding schools and education. And then the opponent of the politician might say, but what about how expensive politicians' salaries are? Sure, it may be true that politicians are making too much money. But again, that is not relevant at all to the discussion about whether or not we need to do a better job of funding education or improving education. Or imagine somebody, let's just call this person Sam. Imagine Sam says, I think we need stricter background checks to reduce mass shootings. And then in response, we can imagine Sam's friend, let's just call this person Alex. Alex might respond by saying, oh, but what about mental health? Lots of people struggle with mental health. Again, that may in fact be true, but how is it related to background checks? Maybe we could do both things. Maybe we could have stricter background checks, and at the same time, we could also do more to help out with regard to mental health. Or imagine somebody else, let's call this person Bob. Bob would say something like, carbon emissions need to be reduced immediately to prevent global warming. And then maybe Jones says in response to Bob, but how can we worry about climate change when there's so many violent crimes in our country? Once again, it is certainly true that there are way too many violent crimes, far too many violent crimes in our country. It may also be true that carbon emissions need to be reduced in order to prevent global warming. Both things could be true. So the fact that we also need to do more to help out and do more to reduce violent crimes, that mere fact is a distraction from the fact that carbon emissions also need to be reduced in order to prevent global warming. So, in each of these examples, then what we have is a situation where somebody's making a claim, and then the response attempts to distract you from what the claim is, to get you to pay attention to and focus on something else that's not necessarily related. Okay, now let's move on to what's called the straw man fallacy. This fallacy distorts or weakens someone's claim, or at least it attempts to do so, by oversimplifying it. The basic idea is that it makes it easier to attack or knock down, right? If I can reconstruct your claim in order to make it, easier to knock down, right? That's what I'm doing when I'm creating a straw man. The straw man is easy to push over, easy to knock down. Now, what this looks like is this: we reinterpret somebody's claim, X, to be a different claim, Y, such that it becomes absurd, or at least likely that most people would end up rejecting Y, which is a different claim. And then we end up attacking Y instead of X, which was the original claim. And based upon attacking Y, we then conclude that X has been refuted. But notice that we never really attacked X itself. Instead, we attacked a different claim, Y. So it's not the case that X has actually been refuted by attacking Y. Now, notice that this fallacy is quite important for several different reasons. First, we should be charitable to our opponent. We should not reconstruct or reinterpret our opponent's claim to be something else that they don't necessarily believe. Secondly, we want to attack the strongest version of our opponent's claim. And here, what I mean by attack is we offer objections, we offer reasons to reject what they believe. And so we don't want to attack some weak version of the opponent's view, maybe something that the opponent doesn't even actually believe. Instead, we want the strongest version of our opponent's view. If we're going to try to show that their view is wrong or should be rejected, we want to reject the version that is most difficult to object to. Another way of putting this is we want to attack the Iron Man version of our opponent's view, not the straw man version. Okay, so let's look at some examples to help us think about this fallacy. Imagine that someone named Bill happens to say, we need to regulate carbon emissions to slow climate change. And then Jim says in response, but my opponent wants to shut down all the factories and put everybody out of work. Well, clearly that's not what Bill said, right? So Jim is attacking some version of what Bill is saying, maybe something that Bill doesn't even believe. And so when Jim says my opponent wants to shut down factories and put people out of work, that's the straw man version of what Bill's trying to claim here. Or imagine a situation where someone named Jack says, I think that we should improve animal welfare standards on farms. And then Steve says in response to Jack, so you're saying that people should just stop eating meat entirely? Well, no, clearly not. That's not what Jack said. And so it would be a straw man to interpret Jack as saying that. Or consider Sarah, who might say, I think schools should teach evolution in science class. But then Jill says in response to Sarah, oh, okay, so then you must think that we should teach children that God doesn't exist. Again, that's not what Sarah said. And so it would be a straw man to interpret Sarah as saying this. In fact, Sarah may actually believe that God exists, but that we should also teach evolution in school. Or imagine that you said to your friend, I've decided to eat less fast food for health reasons. And then your friend says, oh, so you think that everyone who eats fast food is stupid and unhealthy? Well, no, that's not what you said. So your friend is creating a straw man version of this, right? You should be attacking the Iron Man version, the one that you actually hold, the thing that you actually stated, rather than, reinterpreting it to mean something that you don't even believe. All right, so finally, let's take a look at another fallacy that you've probably heard of or thought about at some point in your life. Maybe you have a parent that said something like this to you. This fallacy says basically two wrongs don't make a right. right? The fallacy is claiming that some immoral action can be justified if others have done the same thing or something similar or maybe even worse. And that's a fallacy, right? The mere fact that maybe somebody else has done something similar or worse is not going to give you reason or justification for doing something morally wrong, right? This is likely something you've heard of or something that you're familiar with. And so I think we should be able to see what's wrong here. The problem with this sort of reasoning is that someone else's wrong actions cannot make your actions right or permissible or even okay. Of course, this does not completely rule out the potential for some sort of justification for your actions. You might want to offer some sort of utilitarian reason for why we should justify some actions that would normally be rejected as being morally wrong, but at least maybe in some particular situations, it would be seen as being morally right. For instance, if you can consider like the hurricane, Katrina hurricane that occurred a while back, where people were stranded and without food or shelter. And so a number of people broke into stores in order to get food. They were essentially stealing food in order to feed their children. Right. So utilitarian reasons might justify that action in that particular case because, the greater good is to make sure that your children don't starve, even though normally it would be morally wrong to break in and steal from these stores. But nonetheless, you could justify those actions on utilitarian grounds, but that doesn't mean that you have good reason to justify those claims if somebody else is doing something just as wrong or maybe even worse. Right. The fact that somebody else is doing something wrong is not justification in that particular sort of case. So, once again, just to reiterate here, the mere fact that others are doing something morally wrong does not make it the case that you are justified in doing something morally wrong also. So, let's take a look at some examples of this particular fallacy. Imagine some student says, you really shouldn't have copied your answers on the test, that's cheating. And then another student says in response, well, half the class was cheating, so why shouldn't I also cheat? I can imagine this being the case using ChatGPT, right? If most of the students in class are using ChatGPT to do their work, you might think to yourself, well, I might as well do it too because everyone else is. But the mere fact that other people are cheating doesn't mean that you should also cheat. It doesn't justify that. Or imagine some critic says, your candidate lied about these policies, right? And so they're upset about the fact that some political candidates lying about their policies. And then the supporter responds by saying, oh, well, the other side lies too, so it's fine. Everybody lies in politics. It may be true that way too many people are lying in politics, but that doesn't justify it. That doesn't make it right or okay. Or imagine that your partner says to you, you really shouldn't have flirted with someone else. And then imagine that you said in response to your partner, well, look, you texted your ex last month, so I can do whatever I want. If you said that in response, I'm imagining it would not go very well. Why? Because the mere fact that other people are doing it too doesn't make it right. It doesn't give you justification or reason for doing something wrong also. Or imagine your boss at work says to you, you left early without permission, which I can imagine being something that could get you fired. And then you say in response to your boss, well, other people leave early all the time, so why can't I? That's not going to be a good response. The mere fact that other people might leave early doesn't mean that you have justification for leaving early also. So again, you've probably come into contact or at some time in your life been familiar with these sorts of fallacies where two wrongs don't make a right. So I think that it's helpful to look at these examples when thinking about them as it pertains to your own life. In the next video, we are going to turn our attention away from these fallacies that deal with irrelevant premises, and instead we're going to look at fallacies that involve unacceptable premises. So that's what we'll start doing in the next video.